In today's world, critical thinking has simultaneously become the single most valuable, yet the most underutilized skill. In this video, I'm going to draw upon my years of experience both in the academic world and the business world to show you 5 powerful approaches for developing your critical thinking skills that will make you the most sought-after person for your knowledge and wisdom. And the most vital way to amplify this result is through our 5th approach, which ties approaches 1 through 4 together. So let's get started with our first approach, statistical and scientific reasoning. Now, if you just take a look around you at our modern society, you should be able to immediately understand why statistical and scientific reasoning are so important, and yet so lacking. But which of these statistical and scientific reasoning skills exactly do most people lack? Well, let's discuss 2 of these skills, and along the way, I'll refer you to books and other resources for helping you learn both of them. And these 2 skills are 1, frequentist reasoning, and 2, Bayesian reasoning. Let's start with number 1 here. One of the central tools of frequentist reasoning is what's called the normal distribution, and it's fundamental to how scientists test hypotheses and develop good theories. As we gather more and more data over time, essentially all events in nature will end up being distributed according to this pattern, with the most probable events occurring in the middle, representing the mean. The farther away an event is from the mean, the more improbable it is. And so, even without doing any calculations, here's how you can use this concept in your everyday life. When someone makes a claim, or you see some claim on social media or wherever, get in the habit of doing what's called a hypothesis test. Where do you think the probability of that claim's truth lies on this distribution? Is it highly likely? Or in other words, something we observe happening often or regularly? Or is it something that happens extremely rarely? Well, we're all just a little bit biased, aren't we? So to help you answer this, you can use yet another important tool in frequentist reasoning that most people overlook, but which is extremely useful in everyday life. And that's what's called Simpson's paradox. Simpson's paradox occurs when we assume that the model or data, which represents the average or aggregate figure, accurately represents each individual. For example, in 1973, UC Berkeley did an analysis of its admissions rates and discovered the following. Men were admitted at a rate of 44% and women were admitted at a rate of 35%. And this caused concerns over potential sexism. However, when researchers broke down the data by individual departments, the trend reversed. In most departments, women were actually admitted at a higher rate than men. So what's happening here? Well, women tended to apply to more competitive departments like English or psychology, where the overall acceptance rate was much lower for everyone. Men applied more often to departments like engineering, where admissions were less selective. So when they looked at the raw acceptance rates, it looked like women were being rejected more, yet they weren't. So what's the lesson here? That discrimination doesn't exist? Not at all. The lesson is to be aware of Simpson's paradox. Whenever you hear a statistic or a percentage or a rate of something, understand that without context, it's practically meaningless. And people misuse rates and percentages like this all the time to try to sell you stuff, promote political propaganda, or convince you of whatever. So train yourself to question intelligently, because most people just won't. But this reasoning is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more we could explore here. So if you want to truly hone frequentist reasoning with real-world examples and data, a great place to start is by reading the book Statistical Analysis: The Basics by Christopher Thrain. But an arguably even more practical and everyday skill is number 2 here, Bayesian reasoning. And yes, I say Bayesian, some people say Bayesian, some people say Bayesian, whatever, potato, potato. Bayesian reasoning is yet another school of thought in statistics that allows you to evaluate directly whether one claim or another is more probable. And it's especially useful because, unlike in frequentist statistics, you don't need a lot of data to arrive at valid conclusions. Some of these tools are Bayes' theorem, the Bayes factor, Monte Carlo simulations, and beta distributions with Bernoulli trials. But once again, for the sake of time, I'll refer you to an excellent book to hone your skills here called Bayesian Statistics: The Fun Way by Will Kurt. And he really does make it fun and interesting. So now you might be wondering why there are 2 schools of thought here in the first place. I mean, aren't statistics and probability objectively valid? And so shouldn't there only be one true form of statistics? Well, that's actually a great point, and it's something philosophers have wrestled with for a long time. So if we consider ourselves true critical thinkers. We'll also need to address this question, which we'll do once we get to approach number 5. For now, let's move on to approach number 2 here, logics. Now, you'll probably notice I said logics and not logic, and that's purposeful. You see, just as there are several schools of thought when it comes to statistics and probability, there are several schools of thought when it comes to logic. In fact, there are many types of logic: propositional logic, alethic logic, deontic logic, intuitionistic logic, and even quantum logic. However, what most people mean when they refer to logic is propositional logic. And surprise, surprise, most people make logical mistakes all the time, and it leads them to awful decisions. For instance, imagine someone says, if I don't text my friend back immediately, they'll think I'm mad at them. I didn't text them back right away, so they definitely think I'm mad. At first glance, this sounds reasonable. But if we look closer, this is actually a logical misstep. In fact, this is a common fallacy called affirming the consequent. Even if the statement, if A then B is true, and B is indeed true, it doesn't mean A caused B, or even that A has anything at all to do with B. I actually have a full video teaching you more of these kinds of logical rules, so instead of elaborating with further logical rules and examples here, feel free to check out that video at the video card above. But once again, notice the potential issue here. Namely, shouldn't there only be one true logic if logic is truly objective and foundational? Well, even in mathematics, the philosopher Kurt Gödel intensively studied the foundations of both logic and mathematics and realized that the best we could do is state assumptions. In other words, the very foundations of math, logic, and probability themselves cannot be proved. But then, how should we respond to this? If we consider ourselves true critical thinkers, we should respond to it, rather than simply taking these foundations on faith. Well, once again, we'll explore these kinds of questions once we get to approach number 5. For now, let's explore a radically different approach to critical thinking with number 3 here, post-structuralism. So what the heck is post-structuralism, and why is it one tool you should consider for your critical thinking toolkit? Well, to understand post-structuralism, we first have to understand its radical opposite: analytic philosophy. You see, after World War II, the Western world split into roughly 2 camps with respect to philosophy and the search for truth. The analytic philosophers include thinkers such as Bertrand Russell, Alfred Tarski, A.J. Ayer, John Searle, Saul Kripke, and so many others. These monumental thinkers attempted to understand truth and meaning by analyzing the logical structure of language, and as such, they've built intricate theories using tools and constructs from logic, mathematics, and set theory. But then alongside these analytic philosophers came the post-structuralists, such as Jacques Derrida, Jean Baudrillard, and Gilles Deleuze, and many others who viewed these hyper-logical approaches as totally backward. In a sense, they took a hammer to the hyper-logical systems the analytic philosophers wished to build. And in a nutshell, that's what post-structuralism is. Because of its rejection of objective truth in favor of what's often called situated truth, we really can't say that there is any one method of post-structuralism. Instead, post-structuralism is defined more by its aim than its method. Its aim, put simply, is not to find truth or meaning, but instead to examine interpretations of truth and meaning, examine symbols and symbolism, and analyze the relationships between how people use various terms, concepts, and ideas. Broadly speaking, post-structuralists view truth and meaning as unstable and not fixed. And whether or not you strictly accept this point of view, can you see how it could possibly be helpful for your everyday life? Well, consider this. Do you sometimes find yourself so fixated on what's true versus what's false that you lose perspective on the bigger picture? Do you find yourself so obsessed often with proof and evidence and logical clarity that it actually causes actual breakdowns in your relatability to people and your ability to connect with them? You see, over my years of experience in business, and particularly in my first business, which was almost exclusively focused on face-to-face sales appointments, I came to learn that most people are not thinking using some laws of propositional logic or statistical reasoning. They just aren't. Like post-structuralists, most people aren't focused on truth. Instead, they're focused on and motivated by social meaning. And the reality is that logical and statistical reasoning alone will not therefore help you persuade, influence, or genuinely connect with others. Instead, we have to learn how to use both the highly structured and the loosely structured aspects of critical thinking. If you want to learn how to do this, I have a free masterclass covering this at the link in the pinned comment below, so feel free to check that out. And this discussion of post-structuralism dovetails perfectly with the next approach to critical thinking here: phenomenology. Unlike post-structuralism, phenomenology does accept the reality of truth. It's simply that for phenomenologists, the focus of finding truth lies more in our raw, everyday experience than in the constructs of logic, mathematics, and probability. As the famous philosopher of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, proclaimed, "We must go back to the things in themselves." To understand what this means, consider a well-established model of human decision-making called the random walk model. This model does a pretty good job of describing and predicting the kinds of decisions people make over time. However, take a good look at the model. Is this model how you actually experience decision-making? I mean, when we put it this way, it's obviously absurd, right? And so that's why we can't state that the random walk model, or any model for that matter, actually is decision-making. Instead, as Husserl would point out, decision-making is an experience. And therefore, it's important, as Baudrillard also pointed out, not to get so consumed by models of reality that we begin to think of the models themselves as reality. Okay, so by now we've explored 4 approaches to critical thinking that put you far beyond everyone else in your thinking and self-mastery. But you might have noticed the question I keep raising with each approach, namely, which approach is the right approach? Which approach is the most fundamental, the most valid, the most true? Well, that's kind of the paradox, right? Because the nature of critical thinking is fundamentally anti-dogmatic. Its nature is to question everything and to accept nothing without proof. Yet in order to do any critical thinking in the first place, we must start somewhere with some assumptions that themselves cannot be questioned. And so the solution here comes with our 5th and final approach to critical thinking: the attitude of critical thinking. You see, the whole project of critical thinking seems to fail if we establish it on what we've discovered to be what we might call a paradox of foundationalism. But this then potentially leaves the door open for us to abandon the project of critical thinking altogether, put our hands up, and conclude that it's all just a matter of faith. And so here's the solution. Critical thinking is not a set of tools. Critical thinking isn't even a skill. Critical thinking, instead, is an attitude. And in fact, it's comprised of 2 fundamental attitudes. 1, an attitude of humility, and 2, an attitude of courage. We can understand humility by first understanding its opposite, which stems from a pathology of weakness and insecurity. We can spot this pathology in those who state, "I am absolutely right, and I know the absolute truth." Considering that it is a human making such a statement, the statement becomes that much more absurd. Are you aware that your brain is adapted to see only as much truth as it needs for its survival and no more? Can you perceive ultraviolet light like a bee, smell the world like a dog, see sound like a bat? Can you feel the emotions or understand meaning as each individual in the world and throughout history has? The answer is clearly no. And the great philosopher of science Karl Popper understood as much when he took a similar position that he calls fallibilism. Once we truly internalize this attitude, though, we then need the second attitude, an attitude of courage. Critical thinking requires us to take a psychological leap the vast majority of people never will. But if you take this leap, it will set you free. And that leap is to embrace uncertainty. You see, dogmatic minds, authoritarian minds, they need to create a reality that is orderly and predictable. They project strength only because they possess a deep-seated weakness and insecurity. But do you know what you get by accepting constant change? By embracing disruption? By anticipating instability? Well, recent research has suggested that diverse experiences, even those that expose us to hardship, lead to greater overall life satisfaction than simply the pursuit of happiness. Pursuing critical thinking, then, is essentially the pursuit of self-mastery, to be in control of your mind, to master your thinking, and not simply through the lens of logic, but instead through a much larger lens. If you want to keep leveling up your critical thinking to make a massive impact, not only on your own life, but on the lives of countless others, then be sure to watch this next video.